Maybe we could talk about some examples to better flesh out how noise reflects itself in human judgment. I mean, one of the examples that you go back to in the book many times is the judiciary and how judges will evaluate cases quite differently from one another, and they will evaluate similar cases very differently. But then, I mean, there are also plenty of very topical examples right now. I mean, you wrote this book during the pandemic, so the pandemic wasn't a huge focus in terms of examples, but I'm sure you have plenty from the COVID response as well.
Of course. But the best example, as you said, is noise in sentences, because that really offends our sense of justice and the way that justice should operate. But experiments have shown really a shocking amount of noise, and this is worth illustrating because it's hard to believe. So, in a study that was done with 208 federal judges, that study was done many years ago, they were shown vignettes of crimes with some details about the defendant and some details about the crime. And they had to set a sentence. And what you looked at, and everybody got the same 16 problems and said 16 sentences, and you looked at the variability for within a sentence across people. To give you a sense of the variability, in a case for which the average sentence was 7 years, you would take two judges at random, and the difference between them, the expected difference between them, would be almost 4 years. So this is the lottery that the defendant faces, and which judge will be assigned, and then that example can be used to separate noise into identifiable components, the three components of noise. If you want me to go into this.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. So we're talking about occasion noise.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah. So the first and most, there are two kinds of noise that people really are quite familiar and understand quite easily. And one is that some judges are more severe than others, and others are more lenient. So that on average, the sentences of some judges are higher, more punitive than that of others. This is actually is individual differences in bias. That is, severity and leniency are both forms of bias, and people differ in their bias, and that's one source of noise. That's the first one that people think about, whether judge severe or lenient. Actually, it's not the biggest one. And then there are two others. One is one that people can readily come up with, and you already alluded to that, is the within subject variation, the within judge variation. The same judge looking at the same case will not make the same judgment. There is variability depending on mood or depending on a variety of contextual aspects of the situation that affect the judge at a particular moment. So that the lottery that the defendant faces is a dual lottery. Which judge will I be assigned to, and what mood or what state will that judge be in, because that state is also a source of noise. The most interesting part of noise, the most important and the most obscure, because it's very hard to think about, is that judges differ in systematic and consistent ways in their tastes. That is, some judges are most influenced by whether the crime a violent one or not. Others are less influenced by that than by whether the victim was helpless or not, was an old person or someone who could defend. There is a very, very large number of there's an infinity of possibility for patterns of preferences. Or, a judge might have a preference for and might be lenient to people who remind him of his daughter. And that would be consistent for that judge, but different from all other judges. This source of noise, I would call it consistent idiosyncrasy. That is, it's a variability across people, but it's consistent within the individual. That is, it turns out, the largest component of noise. And people have, as it were, a judgment personality. They have, which is very complex. They have separate and distinguishable attitudes to different crimes or different defendants. And that, I think, is the most interesting form of noise, as well as the largest. But we came to it very slowly. I mean, we, like everybody else we talked to, first thought of what we call level noise, which is severity, leniency, and occasion noise. And only later did we see that actually this interaction or pattern noise or the variability in tastes is the most interesting and the largest.
Well, this pattern noise, though, is sort of what I was alluding to when I brought up the story of the SS officer, because there's sort of a parallel between the judge who is more lenient to defendants who resemble his daughter and the SS officer who is more lenient or perhaps neglectful of people who resemble his child.
Well, I mean, you could easily imagine that an SS soldier who had a daughter instead of a son would not have picked me up. I mean, that is very likely to occur. That's all other things being equal, they could be equally willing to shoot Jews, but if one of them had a son and one of them had a daughter, the probability of their being moved by seeing a trial could be quite different. That would be pattern noise.
Mm-hmm. Now, one question I have here, or maybe it points to a distinction that should be made, but when we're talking about these judges who differ in systematic and consistent ways regarding their tastes, whether they're more interested in crime or helplessness, etc., why do we refer to this as noise rather than bias, or are these just places where bias and noise coincide?
No. What there are, all these tastes are biases, like overall severity is a bias. So if, somebody is predisposed to be lenient to people who resemble his daughter, that's a bias. What creates noise is that different people are biased in different ways. So it's individual differences. And in general, you should think of bias as the error that people share, and of noise as the error that is not shared across measurements. And then it becomes clear what the relationship is.
I see. Yeah, no, that's very helpful. And this is a point that's brought up many times in the book, but so continuing with this example of the judiciary, noise is endemic to the judicial system or the legislative system. Why is it that it is allowed to exist there and it isn't rooted out when it's clearly so problematic and stands in the way of proper justice?
Because it can't be rooted out easily, but it can be denied. And it is denied rather than, it's not that people, that it's a recognized truth that there is noise. It's a denied truth that there is noise in the judiciary. They don't want to hear about it. And when I talk to judges about noise, I'm told to be very gentle and very careful, and preferably to use examples from medicine, because the existence of noise in justice violates the concept of justice. And the whole idea of how a judge functions, the ideal view which is held within that profession, and everything that's around it, is that the judge is, as it were, a measuring instrument for measuring justice, measuring a just punishment. And you don't want to question that measurement because that measurement plays an essential role. And if you say that measurement is noisy, you are questioning the whole system. And there isn't, in fact, an easy solution. You can maybe remediate or reduce noise a bit. You certainly cannot eliminate it altogether, but you can deny it altogether. And that's the preferred solution.
Hmm. But my understanding with regard to the acceptance, I guess, of noise, it's not just that people don't want to accept it, it's that it's also very hard to spot.
That's right. I mean, and there is an interesting aspect to this. That is, when we did a systematic study of the amount of noise, it's not only in the judiciary, it's everywhere we looked at. So, and our conclusion was, well, first of all, you've got to defend or discriminate between judgment and perception, or between judgment and computation in particular. So in computation, there is a simple answer, and when people, there's a true answer, and when people compute, they typically generate that answer. When you assume that judgment has to be involved, if you think about it, you use the word judgment when we expect some noise. We don't use the word judgment unless some disagreement between reasonable people is sort of tolerated. So noise is some noise, the acceptance of some noise, is built into the very concept of using judgment. You don't expect people to make precisely identical judgment. What is shocking to people is the amount of noise. It's not its existence in principle. They understand that they must exist. There is just a lot more, and we measured that in one case, and there was 5 times as much noise as people expected. And it's the difference between the average difference between 2 randomly selected underwriters in an insurance company looking at the same case. The actual difference was 5 times larger than what the executives in that company expected. So it's that underestimate, systematic underestimate of noise that actually motivated the book. People really can't get their head around it. And people are aware of noise in medicine, although they're always shocked when they are told how much noise there is. But in the judiciary, people are vaguely aware of it, but they don't want to talk about it. And in most other places that we looked, we found much more noise than people expected. And so we concluded our observations with wherever there is judgment, there is noise, and there is more of it than you think. And that seems to be a general truth.